Hello, my name is Electa and I did my capstone project on diversity in children's literature. The book I chose is called Amy Hodgepodge, and it's written by Kim Wayans. Amy Hodgepodge is a book that tells the story of a little girl who attends a new school, and she struggles to find her place within the school's social constructs. As many of you can relate, and I'm sure many children go through these sorts of things, where they change schools, attend a new school, um, or sometimes just change friends. However, this story with this particular child tends to be just a little bit different. I will explain to you why in just a moment. In order to analyze why her experiences are different, I found myself jumping into a bit of a time warp. So we have to go backwards a little bit to realize why things are the way they are for her, but also in order to get to where we are today in regards to diversity in children's literature. We're going to look at sociocultural as well as psychological frameworks in regards to children's literature and how they apply to Amy. The major differences between Amy Hodgepodge and other children who tend to have difficult times adjusting in new schools, situations, or social constructs is that Amy is, first of all, a female, which most of us know that being a female has had its uphill battles and struggles, as we've seen in class with the other children's literature. Also, Amy is quad racial. She has a father who is half black and half white, and she has a mother who is half Korean and half Japanese, making Amy a very interesting young lady, um, particularly one that you do not see in children's literature. Leading roles were traditionally reserved for boys, as we saw in some of the books that we read in class. Um, Here I have listed a few examples of some comic books, as well as The Sword and Stone and stories with Dick and Jane. If there were leading roles, they were usually men, and if there were a female, or if there was a female in the story, they tended to be a sidekick or a helper. They also tended to have the passive voice. As you see with Dick and Jane, Dick's name is presented first, Jane's name comes second. Events that indirectly affected our children's literature, a couple of examples I chose were our world wars here in America, as well as women's rights. Let me start with World War One and Two. World War One spanned from 1914 for America, spanned from 1914 until about 1918, and then we entered into World War Two throughout the 20s. The effects that the wars had on women tended to be that with most of the men gone away overseas and most of our labor force away at war, women were encouraged and did step up and took on the role of men, not only in the household, but also in the workforce, which was something that hadn't been seen before. As a result of women taking on these positions and these roles, we ended up with stronger women who took charge. It also changed the social constructs in American society, which ultimately ended up leading to women's rights in the 1940s and 50s. From there, that relates to our story. In comparison to the story, Amy is not only a female with a leading role in the story, she also tends to take charge. As she and her friends had attempted to enter into a talent contest, they had to realize their differences and work together. Amy and her friends were able to realize their similarities as well as their differences, which allowed them to deeply bond with each other. Also, Amy and her friends were able to bond over some commonalities, which were actually that each one of her friends was biracial or mixed in some sort of way, therefore strengthening them and allowing them to not have the quote Rudolph effect of feeling ostracized or left out, as children often do, and as Amy did at the beginning of the story. These things can have psychological effects on children. Sometimes they make us stronger, other times they do not have the best effects. Now we're going to look at a few social socio-cultural issues that came up with this book. We're going to look at racial perceptions and portrayals. In the early 1900s, there were even fewer ethnic characters in children's literature. When there were ethnic characters in children's literature, they tended to be portrayed in the way that society wanted them to be seen, and not necessarily always in the way that they actually were. An example I have here is Charlie Chan, which was a classic series of books. I also have an excerpt from Uncle Remus. I personally own this book. I thought that I would get in touch with the African American experience. I just felt like being black that this was something that I should own, something that I should have read. I got through about a page and a half before I finally gave up. Not only are the characters portrayed in certain ways, but if you can read the excerpt from the Uncle Remus page here, the English and language is also portrayed in the way that, quote, these characters or these people speak, end quote. Which leads us to structural racism. I got this definition from the Aspen Institute, and it basically tells us that structural racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequality. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with, quote, whiteness and disadvantages associated with, quote, color to endure and adapt over time. Structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist, which is a perfect example as to why things like Uncle Remus were written the way they were, and why Charlie Chan and numerous other ethnic or cultured characters were portrayed the way they were. Speaking of which, you may not have heard of a Jollywog doll, and I was just kind of wondering what your opinion of him is. This is a Gollywog doll. Is he racist? Is it a racist toy? This was a very popular toy in the mid 1900s. This Gollywog doll is a character from Florence Kate Upton and Bertha Upton's book, The Adventures of Two Dutch Dolls and a Gollywog. This doll at the time was not considered a racist doll. However, now, again, jumping through that time warp, it seems as something that may not be considered appropriate. But when we look at Raggedy Ann and Andy, do we see anything wrong with them? Why is this toy not considered racist or offensive, especially in comparison to the Gollywog? It is obvious that they are not the typical Caucasian American looking couple. They seem like normal people, possibly slightly below the social norm. But what makes one toy so much more controversial than another? And that's kind of how things are played out in children's literature, not only in the earlier parts of the 1900s, but even today. There's a significant imbalance between white and non white children's literature. It wasn't until the 1960s, about the 1960s, when Ezra Jack Keats came out with this character, Willie, who he placed in a series of books. The first book was The Snowy Day, in which a young little black boy in an urban neighborhood goes outside to play in the snow just like any other character of any other race typically would. And as time goes on and the decades pass, we see other books such as The Doorbell Rang by Pat Hutchins, where you see children of multitudes of different shades. And I've placed a little chart in the middle to where you can see the diversity gap in children's books. It's very similar to the information that we obtained in regards to the assignment we did just a couple of weeks ago about the lack of representation amongst different books. But what can we do about this? Is change happening? Is anything going to be different? What are people doing? Change is coming, as I have pointed out here in a few different books. We are seeing multitudes of multiracial, different races, different socioeconomic statuses, different cultural groups. I even threw in the bottom right corner, almost to the bottom right corner, My Princess Boy. I've personally read this book. It was interesting. But we have books for everyone. And I think that this is very progressive. We've come a long way in just even the last 100 years, even the last 50 years. And that pretty much concludes my presentation. I'm just going to leave you with where I got my information. Here's my works cited page. And I appreciate you taking the time to analyze this book with me.